What exactly are animal rights? So it's going to be a little bit of a philosophical story. White Christian men had earned these rights after it was only for kings and priests. How do we get to include people of different races, people of different religion, as the most important thing that you can possess? And that is inherent value. Good evening, everybody. Yes, this is the name of the organization I work for. It's the perfect, appropriate name for an animal rights organization. We mainly work in undercover area. We do hunt saps and all these kinds of things. The organization asked me tonight to talk about what exactly are animal rights. So it's going to be a little bit of a philosophical story. So I'm not going to show you any footage that is filled with blood and horror. It's going to be explanatory and also a little bit philosophical about where do we actually come from with animal rights. So the motto of our organization, see if I push the right button, yeah. So the motto of our organization is animal rights is 100% animal rights organization. For us, every animal is an individual with a right to life and well-being. And that immediately asks the question then, what exactly does it mean? What are animal rights? And the way we gather here today, the way we traveled here, the way we look, the freedom that we have in our hairdress, the tattoos we have, we take that freedom for granted, but that freedom is only from very, very recent. For the largest part of human history, say at least until we became sedentary agriculturists, say 10,000 years ago, human society was built up in a hierarchy. And that hierarchy made that very few people at the top had freedom to do whatever they like. Everybody else was a subject, not much more than the way we treat animals today. We had kings and priests. They decided for the rest of society what would happen. And the idea of individual freedom, freedom for the people, is very, very recent. And it came more or less about during the French and the American revolutions. Before that time, most of humanity was like cattle, was like a slave. So to go that little step back from animal rights to who deserves rights, who has rights, is who deserves our moral consideration? Who do we care for? Who do we think whose suffering means anything? So, do we care about a chicken in a cage? Do we not care about a chicken in a cage? If there's any Americans in the audience, they will recognize this sentence. It's the first line, I think, of the American Declaration of Independence. And there are some strong words in it. It is about rights, although it is the rights of men, but it says truth to be self-evident. And it also talks about unalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away from you. And these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By the time this was written, in the end of the 18th century, all men are created equal. That didn't mean all humans. It was mainly Christian, white males. Women were not considered in there. People with a different color of skin were not considered in there. So how do we get from that point, basically only 200 years ago, that white Christian men had earned these rights after it was only for kings and priests? How do we get to include people of different races, people of different religion, people of different sexual orientation, different gender? And one important thing was then, how do you define individual freedom? And that individual freedom was defined for humans by a man called John Stuart Mill. He defined the borders of personal freedom. He said, in principle, your freedom as an individual is unlimited, but it ends at the point that it harms others. This is what he wrote in 1865, I think. So what he means by this is, your freedom ends there where you harm others. And then the most important thing is, who are these others? Is that, in the America that he lived in, just those Christian white men that are the others and whose freedom is important? Or do we include a larger amount of people? And people started to think about what gives a human, what gives a person, what gives an individual the right to moral consideration. And an important issue in that is sentience. Sentience is basically the ability to feel pain, and the ability to experience pleasure. Because if you cannot feel pain, if you cannot experience pleasure, it's difficult to see how you have interests, how you have feelings that somebody should care about. So to have moral consideration, it's very important that you have sentience. And the man who popularized that idea, and he made it into a very famous quote that everybody in the animal rights movement knows. And it is, the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And then if somebody can suffer, why should we deny them the rights that humans have, or that white Christian men have? So that was Jeremy Bentham. He made that famous quote, and that was later picked up by another man who wrote a famous book in 1978. The book is called Animal Liberation, and the man was Peter Singer. Most of you will probably have read that book. So both John Stuart Mill, who wrote about liberalism and the borders, the do not harm principle, the borders of your personal freedom, and Jeremy Bentham, and later on Peter Springer, they are all utilitarianists. And they have the belief that all sentient beings, so everybody that can feel pain and everybody that can experience pleasure, deserve equal consideration of their interests regardless of race, gender, or species. And Peter Singer said it in his book Animal Liberation in a slightly different way, but he said it: the interests of every being affected by an action are to be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interests of any other being. And that was a great improvement. Finally, all sentient beings, and there's still discussion on what animals actually feel, but all sentient beings, and it's at least the great apes, the elephants, the dolphins, were all of a sudden included in that moral circle. So what the abolition movement made possible for the slaves, what the suffragettes made possible for women, this book, Animal Liberation, and people who work towards that goal, they included animals in the moral circle. All of a sudden, we were supposed to consider their thoughts. There was one problem with utilitarianism, and that is it goes about maximizing the good. And one disadvantage is there, that you could sacrifice the individual freedom, the individual happiness, the individual pleasure of a tiny few to maximize the pleasure, the feel-good of a bigger group. And that's why in 1983, what I think is the most profound, solid base of the animal rights movement, the book, The Case for Animal Rights, was published by Tom Regan. And he defined value that every individual has as the most important thing that you can possess. And that is inherent value. The value that you have in and of yourself, without that it's important what your use or your utility is to others. And he defined then the beings that have inherent value as experiencing subjects of life. And that is individuals, sentient beings that have interests, that want something, that have feelings, that feel something, who believe and feel things, recall and expect things. For many people, this is how he said it exactly. You can read it for yourself in the book. But for a lot of people, it's difficult to see an animal as having a perspective of the future or a memory of the past. For a lot of people, that's hard to grasp. But if you look towards the animals that you really know well yourself, and that is your pet, your cat, your dog, you understand that they have an understanding about the future. My dog Linus, for instance, he's lying there in the back. He's blind and deaf, so he misses 2 senses. When he wants to go out, he finds somewhere, for sure by smell, one of our shoes. He brings it to us, because he understands that if I put on my shoes, that means we will go outside, and that's a perspective of the future. When he's hungry, he will run around me, jump on the couch, and that's the place where he normally gets fed, on the couch, so that he's away from his big sister who will try to take away his food. If he wants to go outside, he puts his paw on the door handle, and he opens the door by himself if we don't lock it. We've been running behind him quite a few times in the streets. For a blind and deaf dog, he is really inventive that way. But your dog, your cat, they have an expectation of the future. So in the belief of Tom Regan, at least the mammals of the world, the larger mammals of the world, they are subjects of life. They have inherent value. That brings us then to the word speciesism. If you discriminate based solely that individual is part of a certain group, a certain race, or a certain gender, or a certain species, that is discrimination. There is no basis for it. And that makes speciesism falls into the same category of racism and sexism. Racism and sexism are abhorred, at least in open society. And of course, we're working towards a time that speciesism is considered the same kind of evil that racism and sexism are. That's what we're working towards, and that's what we like to see as the global understanding of how we treat others. The man who popularized the word, who first used the word speciesism, is Richard D. Ryder, and this is how he put it down. He made explicitly the comparison between discrimination based on race and discrimination based on species. So what then are animal rights? If you talk about inherent value, the value that you have in and of yourself, independent of your use to others, if the animal rights is then respecting that inherent value, so that you as a person, as an individual, man, women, animal, that you cannot be treated in a way as an instrument, that you cannot be used to the purpose of another. And that has very strong consequences, because every animal in human possession, and that goes from your pet to the animals in factory farming, all those animals are used as an instrument for pleasure, for food. So if we don't want to be speciesists, if we want to include animals in our moral circle, that would mean letting go of all animal possession. So with a right that respects inherent value of an animal, that means animals can no longer be property. That would mean that the ultimate goal would be that no animal would be in human possession. That in the end, we only have wild animals. that would still mean that we cannot show compassion and that we can take in animals in the wild that need care. Like most vegans, animal rights activists, they will not buy a dog from a shop or from a breeder, but many of you will have dogs because there are so many dogs in shelters or in other places that need taken care of, that need a home. So before we come to an end of any animal in possession, that's a long way off. For wild animals, the respect of their inherent value would mean that they have the right to non-interference. Basically, it means we should leave them alone. That they get the right to live where they want to live. That they have the right not to be killed, not to be harmed, not to be hunted, not to be tortured. That they have the right to roam. These animals, and it's a famous example from the Netherlands, they live in a nature area, but that nature area's got walls around it. Every winter, lots of animals starve to death. These are not wild animals. If we respected their inherent value, they could roam, they could go out, the gates would be gone, and they could wander around and go and find their own food. An important right is, of course, bodily integrity. What we do nowadays to the animals in factory farm, we adapt them to the living conditions that we force upon them. So we doctor tails, we dehorn cows, we brand them, we put earmarks in them. And of course, an important right for wild animals would be the right to their habitat. The ever-growing human population is encroaching again and again, more and more on habitat for these animals. A large part of that habitat is taken up by cattle, animals that we keep to eat. If we just gave up that, veganism, a lot of land would become available again for animals. It's not that lions or tigers are endangered because we shoot so many at the moment, because we kill so many. There is just no place for them to live anymore. Elephants are endangered, but there is no space for more elephants. We first need land for them, habitat, and then we can have more elephants. So how do we get then, if we know what animal rights are, how do we get then to living accordingly to it? How do we get to incorporate animal rights into our own values? And that is by living an examined life. You have to think about, why do you believe what you believe? Why do you think what you think? Why do you act how you act? It's important to do self-examination, to live a philosophical life, and define for yourself what are your values. And then you, every time when you have your values, these are my values, you have to look back at your life and say, is this how I see my life? Is this, do I live according to my values? And if you do not live according to your values, do you have to change your values, or do you reform and change your life? I think that is the way that we can all come to a more interested life, invested life, to a life that we can say this is how it should be lived. And if this is what we want for the world, we have to convince other people that these values that you have, that these values are the one that should be general. A lot of people will come to change by arguments. A whole lot of people in the world will never listen to arguments, and they will have to be forced some way or the other. Usually that is by laws, or by taking away the things that are now available in the supermarkets. So respecting the inherent value of all living beings, all sentient beings, and giving animals rights, that means all instrumental use of animals is going to be unjustified and should be eliminated. And that means your food, basically means veganism. What you wear, wool, leather, fur. Animal experimentation will have to stop. All the entertainment, zoos, dolphinariums, and hunting, trapping, wildlife management, and pest control. All these things are a result of expanding your moral circle and giving animals rights. There is a group of people that will say, we don't need a philosophical basis for animal rights, because what is incorporated in animal rights is values that we already value by ourselves. We value compassion, we value courage, we value empathy. But as humans, we often have trouble in expanding that beyond our little tribe, our own little race, our own gender. So the only way that we can get justice, and that is what it's about. It's not about kindness. It's not about empathy in the end, because that comes from us. If you want justice for the animals, they have to have these rights. And that rights can be upheld in a court. Vegan. That brings me to the organization I work for, and I talked quite a bit faster than I expected, so I'll just continue because I can go on with this forever. So the primary campaigns that we as an organization, Animal Rights in the Netherlands and Belgium, are based on these rights. So I'm the campaign leader for Stop the Slaughter. Basically, is about factory farming and slaughterhouses. Then we have a campaign, Ban the Fur. In the Netherlands, fur will be banned by 2024, the fur farms. I think in Belgium, just came through last month, it will be 2023. So I have no idea about Luxembourg, if they even have fur farms. Somebody will probably be able to tell me later on. So that's great. That doesn't mean fur disappears from our stores. We still import coyote fur trimmings for hoodies from Canada and from the US. So the battle is not over once we don't collaborate with this in the Netherlands ourselves. The battle still goes on to empty the... There's very few places where that's worked. Yeah, West Hollywood, Los Angeles is one of the places that is actually fur-free. I think the last speaker talked about that. One important thing is replace animal testing. The Netherlands is a technological society, a knowledge society. All our factories and all our manufacturing has gone basically to Asia. So a lot of universities and a lot of places test on animals. There is a movement now in the Netherlands that, even from our government, that it should be reduced and the alternatives should be weighed in before animal testing is allowed. In practice, it's not happening yet. Almost every application for animal testing is giving a permit. So we're working hard on it. And I'm sure that in the end it's going to work, because there's so many alternatives. And human cells on a chip are such a more important and better model for what will happen in a human than a rat or mice or even a primate. Then we got and the hunting. We do hunt seps in the Netherlands. We're looking at expanding it. It's basically interfering with the work of hunters. So we got a few tools that we use for that. Most important one is infiltration and undercover footage. I see undercover footage, it's usually used in a broader sense. I see undercover footage as actually working in a facility. It could be a slaughterhouse, a farm, a catch team for poultry, and then taking footage with a hidden camera. Besides that, you have covert and overt operations. Covert is walking into a barn at night and taking footage. Overt, you stand in front of a slaughterhouse, for instance, with the safe movement, and you take footage there. Especially with the hunting, we interfere with the practices. In the Netherlands, the animal that's most hunted is geese. The populations have exploded in the Netherlands because there's so much farmland. And then, of course, the farmers will complain that there's too much damage to the crops, and the airports are afraid that the birds will fly into their airplanes. In the Netherlands, we even hunt the geese while they're molting, when they cannot fly, and they're put into, they're hunted together in a corral and then put into a gas chamber and gassed on site. That's something we have been trying to interfere with quite a few times. Of course, there's liberation. In the past, because you're there anyway, inside a barn to film, it's easy to take a few animals away. That makes a big difference in the lives of those animals. It will always be symbolical because we have millions and millions of these animals in barns in the Netherlands and in Belgium. There is just no space in sanctuaries to put all these animals. We really have to stop this industry. We cannot save these animals otherwise. As the announcer mentioned in the opening, I worked a long time for an organization called Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. Paul Watson, the founder, always said, if it's not on tape, it didn't happen. It's very important that you reach an audience that is not ourselves. If you dump the footage that you make in a barn and you dump it on Facebook, probably all the other people that are watching it, they are already animal rights activists, they are already vegans. So the most important thing for our organization is not only to get that footage, but to pitch it to mainstream media outlets. It's easy to put it on our Facebook page and you get 500,000 likes. But those people already agree with you. You probably hear I'm not very used to speaking to audiences, but I practiced this speech in Dutch 2 weeks ago, and I was talking to the Rotary. You're familiar with Rotary? People come together one evening, talk about a subject, have dinner. There was not a vegetarian among them. They ate their little steaks before I gave my speech, and then I showed them footage about how ducks were tortured in the stables. And the impact that you have there is so much larger than talking to your peers, preaching to the choir, as the subject is. Same thing with showings of a movie like Earthlings, Dominion, Cowspiracy, Forks Over Knives. The main effect that you can have with a movie is that everybody takes somebody with them that is not a vegetarian, not a vegan. Take your mother, your father, your brothers or sisters. Or I haven't seen Dominion yet, and I don't really see the need to go and see it because I already know. Yeah, something to think about. The importance of media is get it out to the larger crowd, not to your own peers who already agree with you. In the Netherlands, of course, we're very, very lucky that we have a party for the animals. At the moment, they have 5 seats in parliament, and that is great. Every time we put footage out through mainstream media, they will ask questions in parliament, and that means the minister has to answer questions. That gives us not only a lot of information about how this industry works, but also forces change. Last year, our Belgian colleagues, they filmed in a slaughterhouse called Tielt. I don't know how many people of you here are from Belgian part, but that made an enormous impact there. The slaughterhouse was closed for a week. Everybody promises stronger measures. They filmed later in another place called Activism, where cattle were slaughtered. That place was shut down and is still not open. Mainstream media, then you get the attention. But it's like a circle. You throw a pebble in the water and that circle expands. So when that footage came out in Belgium, some people in the Netherlands were asking, is this happening in the Netherlands too? And the responsible politician at the time immediately came out and said, no, this is not happening in the Netherlands. So a news agency demanded the information. In Dutch it's called a WOP, in English, in America it's called FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. You can demand official information. It came out last July that these things are happening in the Netherlands. Pigs end up alive in hot water baths where they should be dead when their hairs are burned off. Animals were being skinned alive. So actually today, Parliament is debating this subject. How is it possible that these things are happening in the Dutch slaughterhouses while there is a government organization that's just watching all these slaughterhouses 24 hours a day? How is it possible this still happens? So now they want cameras in every slaughterhouse that can be checked. Better education for the people who are doing the slaughtering. So how far you can get the message out there and how far you can push politicians and force legislation, that is where you make the real difference. Of course, we use, say, the traditional methods of activism as well. We do demonstrations. Yesterday we worked together with the Save Movement and Burning Souls 2 days ago. We had a demonstration in The Hague in front of Parliament because of the epidemic of barn fires. And this year in the Netherlands, 100,000 animals already died in fires. So these are animals that never make it to the slaughterhouse. Last year there were 240,000 animals that died just in fires. Most of them are poultry, chicken, but lots of pigs. We had the largest fire a year ago ever. 20,000 pigs died in one fire. That guy is trying to rebuild now and of course expand, so that's how it works. And we had a demonstration, I think July, trying to stop that. At the same time, of course, we do petitions. We collaborate with different organizations that have the same philosophy as us. In the Netherlands, it's Bite Back, also from Belgium, Save Movement, and Burning Souls. One important thing is you have to offer an alternative, and our message is always the same. Everything that we put out, we put one same message under it that we see as the only solution for this enormous injustice, and that is go vegan, change to a plant-based diet. We don't want bigger barns, we don't want more comfortable cages. We want this industry to end completely.